Welcome. Tonight we travel back to the quiet countryside of medieval Europe. As you listen, allow your mind to slow down and relax while we explore what daily life may have felt like for ordinary peasants living many centuries ago. Imagine standing at the edge of a small medieval village just before sunrise. The air is cool and slightly damp from the night. A thin layer of morning mist rests gently over the nearby fields. Simple wooden homes with thatched roofs sit quietly together along narrow dirt paths. Smoke has not yet begun to rise from the hearth fires, and most of the village is still asleep. Unlike the large cities of ancient Rome, medieval villages were small communities surrounded by farmland and forests. Most people who lived here were farmers. Their daily lives were shaped by the seasons, the weather, and the steady work required to grow food from the land. The rhythm of life in the village was simple but demanding. Each day brought familiar routines that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Tonight we will slowly explore what an ordinary day might have been like for a medieval peasant, from the first light of morning to the quiet darkness of night. Peasant homes. The homes of medieval peasants were simple structures built from materials that were available nearby. Most houses were made from wooden frames filled with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw known as wattle and daub. The roofs were usually covered with thick bundles of straw or reeds called thatched roofs. Inside, the home was often just a single room. At the center of the room sat the hearth, where a small fire burned for cooking and warmth. Smoke from the fire slowly drifted upward toward a hole in the roof or escaped through the doorway. Furniture was limited. A wooden table, a few stools or benches, and simple storage chests might fill the room. Many families slept on straw-filled mattresses placed directly on the floor or on wooden frames. Despite their simplicity, these homes were places where families spent most of their time when they were not working in the fields. During the colder months, the warmth of the hearth and the presence of family members helped make the small houses feel more comfortable. Farming the fields. For most peasants, farming was the central part of everyday life. At sunrise, villagers walked from their homes toward the open fields that surrounded the village. These fields stretched across the countryside in long strips of land divided among the farming families. Using simple wooden plows, hoes, and sickles, peasants worked the soil by hand. Oxen were sometimes used to pull plows through the earth, helping prepare the fields for planting. The work was slow and physically demanding. Turning the soil, planting seeds, and caring for crops required long hours of effort. Many crops were grown depending on the region, including wheat, barley, oats, and vegetables. Because farming depended heavily on the weather, peasants watched the skies closely throughout the seasons. A good harvest meant enough food for the coming year, while a poor harvest could bring hardship to the entire village. Animals played an important role in the life of a medieval village. Cows, sheep, chickens, and pigs were commonly raised by farming families. Chickens provided eggs, while cows could provide milk used to make butter and cheese. Sheep were valued for their wool, which could be spun into thread and woven into clothing. Pigs were often allowed to roam near the edges of the village or in nearby forests, feeding on roots, nuts, and scraps of food. Animals were not only sources of food but also important parts of the village economy. Caring for them was part of the daily routine, especially in the early morning and evening hours. By the middle of the day, the sun rises higher over the countryside. The morning coolness fades, and the work in the fields becomes more tiring. Farmers pause briefly to eat a simple midday meal. Bread, cheese, onions, and sometimes small portions of meat make up a typical meal during the working day. These meals are often eaten outdoors while resting beside the fields. After a short break, work begins again. Rows of crops must be tended, weeds removed, and tools repaired when needed. The steady rhythm of farm work continues throughout the afternoon. Back in the village, one of the most important gathering places is the village well. This well provides water for drinking, cooking, and washing. Villagers carry wooden buckets or clay jars to collect water, lowering them carefully into the well before lifting them back to the surface. Because so many people rely on the well, it becomes a place where neighbors often meet and talk. News travels quickly in small villages, and conversations at the well help keep everyone informed about events and changes in the community. The simple act of collecting water becomes part of the social life of the village. Medieval villages were usually small communities made up of only a few dozen families. Many villages contained somewhere between 100 and 300 people, although some were even smaller. The layout of a village often formed around a central open space known as the village green. Nearby stood the most important buildings of the community: the church, the well, and sometimes a small mill used to grind grain. Paths rather than paved roads connected the houses. These dirt paths slowly widened over time as people and animals traveled along them each day. Most villages were surrounded by open farmland divided into long, narrow strips. Each family farmed several strips scattered throughout the fields rather than owning one large piece of land. This system helped ensure that good and poor soil was shared more evenly among the villagers. The open field farming system. In much of medieval Europe, farming followed a method known as the open field system. Instead of fences separating farms, large fields were divided into many narrow strips. Each peasant family worked several of these strips across the shared farmland. Fields were usually divided into 3 sections. One field was planted with crops such as wheat or rye. The second field might grow barley, oats, or legumes. The third field was left fallow, meaning it rested without crops so the soil could recover nutrients. Each year the fields rotated. This method, known as the 3-field crop rotation, slowly improved farming productivity and allowed villages to produce more food than older farming systems. Even with these improvements, farming remained difficult work that depended heavily on weather and soil conditions. The tools available to peasants were simple but effective. One of the most important farming tools was the heavy plow, designed to cut through the thick soils of northern Europe. This plow was usually pulled by teams of oxen or horses. Farmers also used sickles and scythes during harvest time to cut grain stalks. Wooden hoes helped remove weeds between rows of crops. Because iron was expensive, many tools were carefully repaired and reused for many years. Blacksmiths in nearby villages or towns produced metal parts for tools and helped maintain equipment used by farmers. These tools may seem basic by modern standards, but they allowed medieval communities to cultivate large areas of farmland. Most medieval peasants ate a diet based largely on grain and vegetables. Bread was the most important food. It was commonly made from wheat, rye, or barley depending on the region. Another common dish was pottage, a thick stew made by boiling vegetables, grains, and occasionally small amounts of meat in a pot over the hearth. Cabbage, onions, beans, and turnips were frequently used ingredients. Meat was eaten less often by peasants than by wealthy nobles. When available, pork was one of the most common meats because pigs were relatively easy to raise. Fish also played an important role in the diet, especially on religious fasting days when meat was forbidden by the church. Ale or weak beer was commonly consumed instead of plain water, since brewing the drink helped make it safer to consume. The role of the church. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life. At the center of most villages stood a small church where residents gathered for weekly services. Church bells marked important times of day and called villagers together for worship. The church also organized many events in the yearly calendar, including festivals and holidays tied to the agricultural seasons. Priests provided spiritual guidance, but they also served as important community figures who helped record births, marriages, and deaths. For many peasants, faith offered comfort during difficult times such as poor harvests, illness, or harsh winters. The rhythms of religious life became closely connected with the rhythms of farming and village work. Seasonal work in medieval life. Unlike modern jobs, medieval work changed dramatically depending on the season. Spring was a time for planting crops and repairing tools after the winter months. Summer required constant work tending fields, caring for animals, and preparing for the upcoming harvest. Autumn was the busiest season of all. Farmers worked long hours harvesting grain, storing food, and preparing supplies for the winter. Winter was the quietest time for farming, but villagers still had many tasks. Tools were repaired, clothing was made, and animals were cared for inside barns. The entire village moved together through these seasonal cycles year after year. The clothing worn by medieval peasants was usually simple and practical. Most garments were made from wool, which was widely available because sheep were raised throughout much of Europe. Wool kept people warm during cold weather and could be woven into durable fabric. Linen was also used for lighter clothing, especially undergarments, but producing linen required more work and was sometimes less common among poorer families. A typical peasant man might wear a long wool tunic that reached to the knees, tied at the waist with a simple belt. Women usually wore longer tunics or dresses that extended to the ankles. Cloaks made from thick wool were often worn during colder months to protect against wind and rain. Footwear was usually made from leather and shaped into simple shoes or boots. Because clothing was expensive to produce, garments were often repaired many times and worn for years before being replaced. The village blacksmith. One of the most important workers in a medieval village was the blacksmith. Blacksmiths were responsible for shaping metal tools used in farming and daily work. Inside the blacksmith's workshop stood a hot forge where iron was heated until it became soft enough to shape. Using hammers and anvils, the blacksmith created items such as horseshoes, knives, plow blades, nails, and metal fittings for carts and wagons. Because iron tools were essential for farming, the blacksmith's work supported nearly every family in the village. The sound of hammers striking metal was a familiar noise that echoed through the village during the daytime hours. The village mill. Another important building found in many villages was the mill. Grain harvested from the fields could not be used directly to make bread. It first needed to be ground into flour. This work was done using large millstones that crushed grain between heavy circular stones. Many villages used watermills, which relied on the power of flowing streams to turn the millstones automatically. Where streams were not available, windmills were sometimes used to power the grinding process. Farmers brought sacks of harvested grain to the mill where it was ground into flour that could later be used for baking bread. Because the mill served the entire village, it was often owned or controlled by the local lord. Villagers sometimes paid a small portion of their grain as payment for using the mill. Children in medieval villages. Children in medieval villages often began helping with work at a young age. Unlike modern childhood centered around school and leisure, medieval children learned by assisting their families with daily tasks. Young children might help collect firewood, fetch water from the well, or watch over smaller animals like chickens and goats. As they grew older, they gradually learned farming skills from their parents. Boys might help plow fields or repair tools, while girls often assisted with cooking, spinning wool, and caring for younger siblings. Through these everyday responsibilities, children slowly learned the skills they would need as adults in the village. The role of the local lord. Most medieval peasants lived on land controlled by a local lord. The lord typically lived in a nearby manor house or castle and owned much of the surrounding farmland. Peasants were allowed to farm certain strips of land in exchange for labor or a portion of their harvest. This system was part of what historians call the feudal system, a social structure that organized land ownership and responsibilities throughout much of medieval Europe. Although peasants worked their own fields, they were also expected to spend time working the lord's land during certain parts of the week. These obligations formed part of the economic relationship between villagers and the local ruling class. Bread and baking in medieval villages. Bread was the most important food in the medieval peasant diet. Most meals included some form of bread made from grains such as rye, barley, or oats. Wheat bread was considered higher quality and was more common among wealthier families. After grain was harvested and ground into flour at the village mill, it was used to prepare dough for baking. In many villages, families did not always have their own ovens large enough for baking bread. Instead, communities sometimes used a shared village oven where multiple families baked their bread. The dough was usually mixed with water and sometimes flavored with small amounts of herbs or seeds. Loaves were then placed into the hot oven where they slowly baked over the heat of a fire. The smell of fresh bread often filled the village during baking days. Because bread was such an essential food, the success of the grain harvest had a direct impact on how much bread families could eat throughout the year. Spinning wool and making cloth. Clothing for most villagers was made locally using wool from sheep. After sheep were sheared in the spring, the wool needed to be cleaned, combed, and spun into thread before it could be woven into cloth. Spinning wool was a common task performed inside peasant homes. Using a simple tool known as a spindle, fibers of wool were twisted together to create strong thread. Later in the medieval period, spinning wheels became more common and allowed thread to be produced more quickly. Once enough thread was prepared, it could be woven on a loom to create fabric. This process required patience and skill, and it often took many hours of work to produce enough cloth for a single garment. Because of the time involved, clothing was valuable and carefully maintained. Medieval medicine. Medical knowledge in the medieval period was limited compared to modern medicine. Many illnesses were treated using herbal remedies prepared from plants growing in nearby forests or gardens. Common herbs such as sage, mint, and thyme were believed to have healing properties. Village healers or local wise women sometimes prepared mixtures of herbs to treat common problems like fevers, wounds, or stomach pains. Because scientific knowledge of disease was still developing, many people also believed illness could be connected to spiritual or supernatural causes. Prayer and religious rituals were often used alongside herbal treatments. Although medical practices were simple, they reflected the knowledge available at the time. The sound of village life. Throughout the day, a medieval village was filled with a variety of familiar sounds. Farm animals such as chickens, cows, and pigs moved around the village, creating constant background noise. Tools striking wood or metal echoed from workshops where craftsmen repaired equipment. Voices carried along dirt paths as neighbors spoke with one another while working or walking between homes. Church bells rang at certain hours of the day, marking time for prayer or gatherings. Together, these sounds created the everyday atmosphere of a small rural community. The manor system. Most medieval peasants lived within what historians call the manorial system. A manor was an agricultural estate controlled by a local lord. The manor usually included farmland, forests, a village, and sometimes a small castle or manor house where the lord lived. The land of the manor was divided into different parts. Some fields were farmed by peasants for their own families, while other land known as the domain belonged directly to the lord. Peasants were required to work several days each week on the lord's fields as part of their obligations. In return, they were allowed to live on the land and farm their own strips of farmland. The manor system formed the basic economic structure of much of medieval Europe. Life for peasants was closely tied to the land they farmed and the authority of the local lord. The village church. The village church was often the most important building in a medieval community. Even in small villages, the church served as a gathering place where people came together regularly. Church services were usually held on Sundays, and attendance was expected for most villagers. Inside the church, candles illuminated simple wooden benches and stone walls. The priest led prayers and read passages from religious texts, often in Latin, which many villagers did not fully understand. Even so, the rituals and traditions of the church were deeply familiar. The church also marked important life events such as baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Because of its role in both religion and community life, the church stood at the center of village society. Forests and gathering resources. Beyond the farmland surrounding the village often lay large areas of forest. These forests provided important resources for medieval communities. Villagers collected firewood used to heat homes and cook food. They also gathered berries, nuts, mushrooms, and herbs growing naturally in the forest. In some areas, pigs were brought into the forest during certain seasons to feed on fallen acorns and other natural food. The forest was both useful and mysterious. While it provided valuable resources, it was also a place that villagers approached with caution because of wild animals and the difficulty of navigating deep woodland areas. Medieval markets. Although villages were small, many peasants occasionally visited nearby market towns. These markets allowed farmers and craftsmen to trade goods with people from surrounding communities. Market stalls displayed vegetables, grains, cloth, tools, pottery, and livestock. Farmers might sell extra produce from their fields while purchasing items they could not easily make themselves. Markets also served as places where news traveled between communities. Travelers, merchants, and villagers exchanged information about events happening in nearby towns or distant regions. For many peasants, visiting the market was one of the few opportunities to experience life beyond their own village. The importance of the seasons. Life in a medieval village was closely connected to the cycle of the seasons. Each part of the year brought different responsibilities for farmers. Spring was a time of planting and preparing fields after the cold months of winter. Summer required constant attention to growing crops and caring for animals. Autumn brought the harvest, when farmers worked long hours gathering grain and storing food for the coming winter. Winter was quieter in terms of farming, but villagers still had many tasks such as repairing tools, weaving cloth, and caring for livestock. Because survival depended on successful harvests, villagers paid close attention to seasonal changes throughout the year. Taxes and payments. Life for medieval peasants involved many different obligations and payments. Although peasants farmed their own strips of land, they were required to give a portion of their harvest to the lord who owned the manor. This payment could include grain, vegetables, eggs, or livestock. In addition to these payments, peasants also paid a tax to the church known as the tithe. The tithe usually required villagers to give about 1/10 of their agricultural produce to support the local church. Other small fees could appear throughout the year. For example, villagers might pay to use the lord's mill for grinding grain, or the lord's oven for baking bread. These payments were part of the economic structure that supported the manor and the institutions surrounding it. Medieval cooking. Cooking in medieval peasant homes took place over the open hearth inside the house. Large iron pots were suspended over the fire using hooks or chains. Most meals were cooked slowly in these pots, allowing ingredients to simmer together for long periods. One of the most common dishes was pottage, a thick stew made from vegetables, grains, and sometimes small amounts of meat. Because ingredients varied depending on the season, pottage could taste slightly different throughout the year. Vegetables such as cabbage, onions, leeks, and beans were often added to the stew. Herbs grown in small gardens near the house were also used to add flavor. This type of cooking allowed families to prepare filling meals using simple ingredients available from their farms. Roads and travel. Travel during the medieval period was often slow and difficult. Most roads were simple dirt paths that connected villages to nearby towns. These roads could become muddy during rainy weather and were sometimes difficult for carts to travel. Because of these conditions, most peasants did not travel very far from their villages. Journeys to market towns or nearby settlements were usually made on foot or with small carts pulled by animals. Travelers such as merchants, messengers, and pilgrims sometimes passed through villages as they moved between towns and cities. Although travel was limited for many peasants, these visitors helped bring news and stories from distant places. Village justice and law. Medieval villages also had systems for resolving disputes and maintaining order. Many villages held meetings known as manorial courts. These gatherings were overseen by officials representing the local lord. During these meetings, villagers discussed issues such as disagreements over land, damage to crops, or unpaid obligations. The court could also assign small punishments or fines when someone broke village rules. Because the community was small and everyone knew one another, maintaining cooperation was important for daily life. The manorial court helped ensure that village rules were followed. Craft workers in the village. Although most villagers worked as farmers, some people specialized in important crafts. The carpenter built wooden structures such as houses, carts, and tools. The cooper created wooden barrels used to store food and liquids. The weaver produced cloth using thread spun from wool or linen. These craftsmen played important roles in supporting village life. Their work allowed tools, clothing, and equipment to be produced locally rather than purchased from distant towns. The presence of these specialized workers helped the village function as a small but complete community. Marriage and family life. Marriage was an important part of life in medieval villages. Most people married within their own communities or in nearby villages. Weddings were often arranged with the help of families, although the final decision usually involved the couple as well. The church played a central role in marriage ceremonies. Couples were married in the local church, often in front of family members and neighbors. Marriage helped create stable households where families could share the work required to manage farmland, animals, and daily responsibilities. Children were an important part of village life because they eventually helped with farming and household tasks. Large families were common, although life in the medieval world could also be difficult due to illness and harsh living conditions. Despite these challenges, family relationships formed the foundation of village society. Harvest time. The most important season in the medieval farming year was the harvest. During late summer and early autumn, villagers worked together to gather the crops that had grown throughout the year. Using sickles and scythes, farmers cut the grain stalks by hand. The harvested grain was then bundled into sheaves and carried from the fields. This work required many people, and entire families often participated. Because the harvest determined how much food would be available for the coming winter, it was treated with great seriousness. A successful harvest meant security and stability for the village. A poor harvest, however, could bring hunger and hardship during the colder months. Storing food for winter. After the harvest was completed, villagers focused on preserving and storing food for the winter months. Grain was stored in large containers or storage buildings to keep it dry and protected from pests. Vegetables such as onions and turnips were kept in cool areas where they could last longer. Meat was sometimes preserved by salting or smoking, allowing it to remain edible for extended periods. Cheese and butter made from milk were also stored for later use. Because winter farming was limited, these stored foods were essential for survival during the cold season. Careful preparation during autumn helped ensure that families would have enough food to last until spring. Medieval music and entertainment. Although life required hard work, medieval villagers still found ways to enjoy moments of entertainment. Music was one of the most common forms of recreation. Simple instruments such as flutes, drums, and stringed instruments were sometimes played during gatherings or celebrations. Songs and storytelling were also popular forms of entertainment. Traveling performers occasionally visited villages, bringing stories, music, and news from other regions. These performances were rare but welcomed events that provided a break from the routines of work and farming. Even small moments of music and storytelling helped bring communities together. The approach of winter. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, life in the village began to change. The days became shorter, and the temperature dropped across the countryside. Farming work decreased as the fields rested beneath the cold weather. Villagers spent more time indoors repairing tools, weaving cloth, and maintaining their homes. Animals were often brought closer to the village so they could be cared for during the colder months. Fires burned more frequently inside homes as families relied on the warmth of the hearth. Winter was a quieter season, but it remained an important time for preparing for the return of spring. Castles and the local lord. Not far from many medieval villages stood the home of the local lord. In some regions this was a fortified castle, while in others it might be a large manor house surrounded by walls. Castles served several purposes. They were homes for the noble family who controlled the land, but they also functioned as defensive structures during times of conflict. Thick stone walls, towers, and gates helped protect the people inside. Peasants living nearby often looked to the castle as a place of safety if danger threatened the village. Although peasants rarely entered the castle itself, its presence reminded them of the authority and protection provided by the lord who governed the manor. Monks and monasteries. In many parts of medieval Europe, monasteries were located not far from villages. Monasteries were communities where monks lived lives devoted to prayer, study, and work. These religious communities often owned farmland and gardens where monks grew crops and raised animals. Monks also copied books by hand, preserving important religious and historical texts. Because books were rare and expensive, monasteries became important centers of learning during the medieval period. Villagers sometimes visited monasteries for guidance, medical help, or spiritual advice. The presence of these religious communities helped connect rural villages to wider religious traditions across Europe. Pilgrimages. Religion was deeply important to many people in the medieval world. One way individuals expressed their faith was through pilgrimages. A pilgrimage was a long journey made to visit a sacred location or shrine. Some pilgrims traveled to famous destinations such as Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Along the roads of Europe, pilgrims could sometimes be seen walking with staffs, carrying small bags, and wearing simple cloaks. When pilgrims passed through villages, they often shared stories about distant places they had visited. For villagers who rarely traveled far from home, these travelers offered rare glimpses of the wider world beyond their fields. Education in the medieval world. Formal education during the medieval period was limited for most peasants. Reading and writing were skills usually taught within churches or monasteries. Children of noble families sometimes received education from tutors or attended schools connected to religious institutions. Peasant children, however, typically learned practical skills by helping their families with daily work. Through farming, cooking, crafting tools, and caring for animals, children gained the knowledge needed to continue village life in the future. Although formal schooling was uncommon, knowledge was still passed from one generation to the next through experience and instruction within families. The changing light of evening. As the day slowly moves toward evening, the activity of the village begins to quiet. Farmers return from the fields carrying tools used throughout the day. Animals are gathered and brought into pens or barns for the night. Cooking fires are lit once again inside the small homes, sending thin trails of smoke into the evening air. The warm glow of the setting sun spreads across the countryside, casting long shadows over the fields and village paths. After a long day of work, families gather inside their homes to share simple meals and quiet conversation. The busy rhythms of the day gradually slow as night approaches. Evening meals. After returning from the fields, families gathered around the hearth to prepare the evening meal. Because the hearth served as both the kitchen and the primary source of warmth, most household activities took place near the fire. The evening meal was often similar to the midday meal, but sometimes slightly larger because the day's work was finished. Bread, pottage, cheese, and vegetables were common foods placed into wooden bowls or shared from a single pot. Family members sat on benches or stools around the fire while eating. Although the meals were simple, this time together allowed families to rest after the long hours of labor spent outdoors. The warmth of the hearth and the glow of firelight made the small homes feel more comfortable as darkness spread across the village. Life inside the home at night. As the evening continued, families remained inside their homes where the hearth provided light and warmth. Oil lamps or small candles sometimes helped illuminate the room, although these were used carefully because they required valuable resources such as oil or wax. Many nighttime tasks still needed attention. Clothing might be repaired, wool might be spun into thread, and tools could be cleaned or prepared for the following day. Because homes were small and families lived close together, these activities often happened in the same shared space. Conversations continued quietly while people worked with their hands beside the fire. The quiet countryside. Outside the homes, the countryside slowly became darker and quieter. Unlike modern cities, medieval villages had very little artificial lighting. Once the sun disappeared and the fires inside homes burned low, most of the village rested in near darkness. The surrounding fields and forests became calm beneath the night sky. Occasionally the sounds of animals could be heard in the distance. Owls called from the trees, and the rustling of small creatures moving through grass or leaves added subtle sounds to the nighttime environment. The medieval night sky. Without the lights of modern towns and cities, the medieval night sky appeared remarkably clear. Countless stars stretched across the sky above the quiet countryside. For people living in medieval villages, the stars were a familiar sight each night. They were used by travelers and sailors for navigation and were often connected to stories, myths, and religious beliefs. Looking upward on a clear night, villagers could see the slow movement of constellations across the sky. The vast sky above the village reminded people that their small community existed within a much larger world. The village at rest. As the night deepens, most villagers prepare for sleep. After a full day of work, rest is necessary for the tasks that will begin again in the morning. Families settle onto simple beds or straw mattresses placed inside their homes. The fire in the hearth slowly fades as the room grows darker. Outside, the paths of the village remain quiet. The fields rest beneath the night sky, waiting for the return of the morning sun. And as the village sleeps, the rhythms of medieval life pause briefly before another day begins. Medieval trade and traveling merchants. Although most peasants spent their lives within a few miles of their village, the medieval world was not completely isolated. Trade routes slowly connected distant towns, cities, and regions across Europe. These routes were traveled by merchants who carried goods from place to place, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles over the course of a year. For villagers, traveling merchants were often the main connection to the outside world. When a merchant arrived in a nearby town or village, people gathered to see the goods they carried. Some merchants sold cloth, spices, metal tools, or pottery that could not easily be produced in rural communities. Spices were especially valued because they allowed food to be flavored and preserved. Pepper, cinnamon, and other spices traveled long distances along trade networks stretching from Asia and the Middle East into Europe. By the time these goods reached small villages, they were rare and expensive. Most peasants could not afford luxury goods, but they still benefited from trade in smaller ways. Traveling traders might bring improved tools, better metal blades, or useful household items that could last for many years. Trade routes also carried information. Merchants shared news about distant regions, recent political events, or stories about cities far beyond the countryside. For villagers who rarely traveled, these conversations offered glimpses of a much larger world. Although travel remained slow and difficult during the medieval period, these trade connections gradually linked rural communities to wider economic networks. The medieval market day. Market days were some of the most active events in medieval rural life. While villages themselves were small, nearby towns often hosted markets once or twice each week. On these days, people traveled from surrounding villages to buy and sell goods. Farmers brought baskets of vegetables, grain, eggs, butter, and cheese to sell. Craftsmen displayed tools, clothing, pottery, and wooden goods made in local workshops. Merchants arriving from distant regions sometimes offered rare items such as fine cloth or metal products. The market square quickly filled with stalls and temporary tables arranged in rows. The sounds of conversation, bargaining, and animals filled the air as people moved from stall to stall examining goods. Market days were not only important for trade, they were also important social gatherings. People from different villages met, shared news, and exchanged information about crops, weather, and events in surrounding regions. Because these markets brought together many people at once, they also became places where traveling entertainers sometimes performed. Musicians, storytellers, and performers occasionally entertained the crowds while merchants continued their business. By the end of the day, many villagers returned home carrying goods they could not produce themselves, while merchants packed their remaining supplies and prepared to travel to the next market. Tools and agricultural technology. The tools used by medieval peasants were simple but carefully designed for their work. Farming required equipment that could withstand heavy use while being repaired easily when broken. One of the most important tools was the heavy plow, which allowed farmers to turn the dense soil found in many parts of northern Europe. Unlike lighter plows used in earlier times, the heavy plow cut deeper into the ground and created furrows where seeds could be planted more effectively. Plows were often pulled by teams of oxen or horses. Oxen were strong animals capable of pulling heavy loads, though they moved slowly. Horses were faster but required more food and care. Another essential tool was the scythe, used for cutting tall grass and grain during harvest. The curved blade allowed farmers to swing the tool in wide arcs, cutting multiple stalks at once. Smaller tools such as hoes, spades, and wooden rakes helped farmers manage weeds and prepare the soil. Many of these tools included iron blades attached to wooden handles. Because metal was valuable, damaged tools were rarely discarded. Instead, they were brought to the blacksmith who repaired them by heating and reshaping the metal. These basic tools formed the foundation of medieval agriculture and allowed villages to grow enough food to sustain their populations. Village festivals and community gatherings. Life in a medieval village was filled with hard work, but communities also shared moments of celebration. These celebrations often followed the agricultural calendar, marking important points during the year. One of the most important celebrations occurred after the harvest. Once crops were safely gathered and stored, villagers gathered to celebrate the successful end of the farming season. Harvest festivals often included shared meals prepared from freshly gathered food. Bread, roasted meats, vegetables, and ale were enjoyed together as people relaxed after weeks of intense labor. Music and dancing sometimes accompanied these gatherings. Simple instruments such as flutes, drums, and stringed instruments helped create a festive atmosphere. Religious holidays also provided opportunities for celebration. Christmas, Easter, and various saints' days were marked with church services followed by community meals and gatherings. These celebrations strengthened the social bonds within villages. After months of demanding work in the fields, festivals allowed people to enjoy time together and share in the success of the season. The role of women in medieval villages. Women played essential roles in the functioning of medieval households and villages. Their work supported nearly every aspect of daily life. Inside the home, women were responsible for preparing meals, baking bread, and maintaining the hearth fire. They also produced clothing by spinning wool and weaving cloth. Women often cared for small animals such as chickens, which provided eggs used for food and trade. Gardens located beside many homes were also maintained by women. These gardens produced vegetables and herbs used in cooking and medicine. During busy seasons such as planting and harvest, women frequently worked alongside men in the fields. Farming was a shared responsibility that required the effort of entire families. Women also played important roles in raising children and passing practical knowledge from one generation to the next. Although medieval society often limited women's legal rights compared to men, their contributions were essential to the survival of the household and the village. Disease and health in the medieval world. Life in the medieval period included many challenges related to health and disease. Medical knowledge was limited, and many illnesses were poorly understood. Common diseases included infections, fevers, and illnesses caused by contaminated water or poor sanitation. Herbal remedies were often used to treat these conditions. Plants such as sage, rosemary, and mint were believed to contain healing properties. Local healers sometimes prepared mixtures of herbs that were applied to wounds or consumed as medicine. Monasteries also played an important role in medical care. Monks often studied ancient medical texts and maintained gardens where medicinal plants were grown. Despite these efforts, serious illnesses could spread quickly through communities. Outbreaks of disease sometimes affected entire villages, reminding people of the fragile nature of life during the medieval period. The medieval night. As night fell over the countryside, the pace of life slowed dramatically. Without artificial lighting, most activities ended soon after sunset. Homes were illuminated by small oil lamps or candles, but these sources of light were limited and used carefully. Outside, the village quickly became quiet. Dirt paths and fields disappeared into darkness, and only faint light escaped from the windows of homes. Animals settled into barns and pens for the night, while families gathered around the hearth. Because the countryside lacked the noise and lights of modern cities, the night sky appeared incredibly clear. Thousands of stars stretched across the sky above the silent fields. For villagers who spent their days working the land, these quiet hours of rest were essential before another day began. Reflections on medieval village life. Although medieval life could be difficult, villages provided strong communities built around shared work and cooperation. Families supported one another during busy farming seasons and gathered together during times of celebration. Daily life followed rhythms shaped by the land, the seasons, and the traditions passed down through generations. While technology and living conditions have changed dramatically since the medieval period, the experiences of these villagers remain an important part of human history. Their work helped shape the agricultural landscapes of Europe and supported the development of towns and cities that would grow in later centuries. Even today, the quiet fields and villages scattered across Europe still reflect many patterns first established during the medieval era. Medieval law and punishment. Maintaining order in medieval villages required systems of law that were very different from modern legal systems. Most local disputes were handled through manorial courts, which were organized by the lord who controlled the land. These courts met regularly and were attended by villagers who brought forward complaints or disagreements. Common issues included disputes over farmland boundaries, unpaid obligations, or damage caused by animals wandering into another person's crops. Rather than long trials, these cases were often resolved quickly through discussions and testimony from neighbors. Punishments were usually designed to discourage future problems rather than remove people permanently from the community. Fines were one of the most common penalties. A villager who broke certain rules might be required to pay a small amount of money or goods. Public embarrassment was another form of punishment sometimes used during the medieval period. Devices such as the stocks placed individuals in public spaces where neighbors could see them while they served their punishment. Because villages were small communities where everyone knew each other, maintaining cooperation and reputation was extremely important. The importance of water. Access to water was essential for every medieval village. Most communities were built near reliable water sources such as rivers, streams, or natural springs. Where these were not available, villages relied on wells that were carefully dug into the ground to reach underground water. The village well was often one of the busiest places in the community. Each day, villagers carried buckets or clay containers to the well to collect water for cooking, drinking, and washing. Because wells served many families, they became natural gathering places where neighbors talked and exchanged news. Water was also important for farming and industry. Streams powered watermills, which ground grain into flour for making bread. Water was used for washing wool, soaking leather during tanning, and assisting in certain types of metalworking. Without reliable water supplies, medieval villages would struggle to survive. For this reason, the location of water sources often determined where villages were first established. Life during harsh winters. Winter could be one of the most challenging seasons for medieval peasants. Cold temperatures, snow, and frozen ground made farming impossible for several months. During this time, villagers depended heavily on the food they had stored during the autumn harvest. Homes were heated using the hearth fire located in the center of the house. Families gathered around this fire for warmth and light. Because daylight hours were shorter in winter, much of the work done during these months took place indoors. People repaired tools, spun wool into thread, and produced clothing that would be used during the coming year. Animals were also kept closer to the village during winter so they could be protected and fed more easily. Despite these challenges, winter also created moments of rest after the intense labor of harvest season. Villagers spent more time indoors with their families while waiting for the return of spring and the beginning of another farming cycle. Medieval travel and pilgrims on the roads. Although most peasants spent their lives close to the villages where they were born, the medieval world was not completely isolated. Roads connected villages, towns, monasteries, and cities across Europe, and travelers occasionally passed through the countryside. These roads were usually simple dirt paths that followed natural terrain. In dry weather they were easy enough to walk along, but during rainy seasons they could become muddy and difficult for carts to cross. Merchants were some of the most common travelers using these roads. They carried goods such as cloth, metal tools, spices, and pottery between towns and marketplaces. When merchants passed through rural villages, they sometimes stopped to rest, trade small items, or asked for directions. Another type of traveler frequently seen on medieval roads was the pilgrim. Pilgrimages were religious journeys taken by people who wished to visit sacred sites. These destinations might include famous churches, shrines, or cities connected with important religious traditions. Some pilgrims traveled to Rome. Others journeyed to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or to holy sites connected with saints. Pilgrims usually traveled on foot, carrying simple belongings such as food, water, and a walking staff. Many wore cloaks and wide-brimmed hats to protect themselves from sun and rain. Villagers often offered pilgrims food, shelter, or directions as they passed through the countryside. Because pilgrims traveled great distances, they sometimes shared stories about lands far beyond the village fields. For peasants who rarely traveled far from home, these conversations could be fascinating glimpses into distant parts of the medieval world. The end of the day in the village. As evening deepens and the last light of the sun disappears beyond the fields, the village gradually becomes quiet. Cooking fires burn low inside the small homes as families finish their evening meals. Tools used during the day are placed near the door, ready to be carried back to the fields when morning arrives. Animals rest inside barns or small pens beside the houses. The narrow dirt paths that connect the homes grow still as villagers settle inside for the night. Above the countryside, the stars appear once again across the sky. For a few peaceful hours, the village rests between the hard work of yesterday and the responsibilities that will begin again tomorrow. Life for medieval peasants followed these rhythms day after day, season after season, shaped by the land and the traditions passed down through generations. And as the quiet night settles over the fields and forests, the small village sleeps beneath the wide medieval sky. Medieval forests, and the edge of the village. Beyond the farmland surrounding most medieval villages stretched areas of forest that played an important role in rural life. These forests provided many of the resources needed for daily survival. Villagers gathered firewood from fallen branches to heat their homes and cook their meals. Wood was also used to repair houses, construct fences, and build farm tools. In addition to wood, forests provided a variety of natural foods. People collected berries, mushrooms, nuts, and herbs that grew beneath the trees. These foods helped supplement the grain-based diets that most peasants relied upon. Pigs were often brought into the forest during certain seasons to feed on acorns and roots found on the forest floor. This practice, known as pannage, allowed villagers to raise animals using natural food sources available in the woodland. Despite its usefulness, the forest was also a place that people approached with caution. Large wild animals such as wolves and wild boar sometimes lived in deeper parts of the woodland. Travelers moving through forests had to remain alert, especially when walking alone or after dark. The forest could also appear mysterious to villagers because it was less familiar than the open farmland surrounding their homes. Stories and legends about spirits, strange creatures, and hidden dangers sometimes became part of the folklore shared among communities living near these wooded areas. Even so, the forest remained an essential part of village life, providing materials and food that helped sustain medieval households throughout the year. Medieval clothing and textile work. Clothing in medieval villages required a great deal of time and effort to produce. Most garments were made from wool, which was obtained from sheep raised by farmers across Europe. Each spring, sheep were sheared so their wool could be collected. After the wool was gathered, it needed to be cleaned and combed to remove dirt and tangled fibers. Once cleaned, the wool was spun into thread using a simple tool called a spindle. This process involved twisting fibers together to form a long, strong strand that could later be woven into cloth. Later in the medieval period, spinning wheels became more common and allowed thread to be produced more quickly. Once enough thread had been prepared, it was woven on a loom to create fabric. This weaving process produced the cloth used to make tunics, cloaks, and other garments worn by villagers. Because producing fabric required so much labor, clothing was considered valuable. Garments were carefully repaired whenever they became worn or torn. Patches were often sewn onto clothing so it could continue to be used for many years. Colors in peasant clothing were usually simple and natural. Brown, gray, and dull green shades were common because these colors were easiest to produce using natural dyes. Brighter colors were more difficult to create and were often associated with wealthier members of society. Even though clothing styles were simple, the work involved in producing these garments was an important part of daily life inside medieval homes. Closing reflection: the rhythm of medieval life. When we look back at the lives of medieval peasants, it becomes clear that their world was shaped by rhythms very different from our own. The passing of the seasons determined when fields were planted and harvested. The rising and setting of the sun guided the hours of work and rest throughout each day. Communities were small, and people depended heavily on cooperation with their neighbors in order to survive. Every task, from planting grain to baking bread, required patience and steady effort. Although the work was demanding, the routines of village life created a sense of stability that continued across generations. Families lived, worked, and rested within the same landscapes year after year. The fields surrounding the village, the forest at its edge, and the narrow dirt paths connecting each home formed the familiar environment of everyday life. And as night falls once again across the quiet countryside, the village rests beneath the wide medieval sky, waiting for another day to begin. The quiet medieval countryside before dawn. As the night continues across the medieval countryside, the village remains calm and still. The fires inside the small homes have burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearths. Families sleep closely together inside their wooden houses, resting after the long work of the day. Outside, the narrow dirt paths that connect the homes lie empty beneath the dark sky. The surrounding fields stretch quietly across the landscape, their rows of crops barely visible beneath the moonlight. Occasionally the sound of an animal can be heard in the distance. A horse shifts inside a nearby barn, or a small creature moves through the grass along the edge of the fields. Beyond the farmland, the forests that border the village stand silent in the darkness. The trees move gently in the night breeze, their branches swaying softly above the forest floor. For the people who live in the village, these quiet hours of the night are some of the most peaceful moments of the entire day. There are no tools striking the soil, no carts moving along the paths, and no voices echoing through the streets. Only the quiet countryside remains. Above the village, the stars stretch across the sky in patterns that people of the medieval world had watched for generations. Without the lights of modern towns and cities, the night sky appeared incredibly clear. Countless stars filled the darkness above the fields and forests. Travelers sometimes used these stars to guide their journeys across long distances. For villagers, however, the stars were simply a familiar sight that returned each night as they rested before another day of work. Gradually the night begins to pass. Far beyond the eastern horizon, the first faint signs of morning slowly begin to appear. The sky lightens slightly, shifting from deep black towards softer shades of blue and gray. Soon the village will begin to awaken once again. Fires will be lit in the hearths, farmers will gather their tools, and animals will be led from their barns into the fields. Another day of work, conversation, and quiet village life will begin. For now, however, the medieval countryside rests in these final peaceful moments before dawn. The fields remain still. The forests remain quiet. And the small village sleeps beneath the fading stars. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the world of medieval village life. If you found this journey through history relaxing, you are always welcome to return for more calm stories from the past. From ancient civilizations to quiet medieval villages and distant corners of the historical world, there are many more peaceful journeys still ahead. For now, rest well, and thank you for listening to Dreamtime History.